Stadlen and journalist and author Janelle Aldred. Lovely to see you both. Welcome. So, as you would imagine, an awful lot on the front pages going over Friday's summit between President Putin and Trump, and a little bit more detail emerging. There wasn't much in the immediate aftermath, was there? But some of the papers picking up some of the demands that at least Putin is putting forward. The Sunday Telegraph suggesting he's saying, give me some land and I'll stop fighting. Yeah,
the concern for Ukraine, for Zelensky, for all of those of us who believe in justice and as fair a result from this disaster and from this Russian invasion of Ukraine as is possible, and for European leaders who seem to me to be sort of increasingly desperate at the moment, that Trump seems to support Putin's demand for a land grab. And Zelensky is determined, I think, not to give up Donetsk. I don't think he wants to give up anything, and indeed I think it's written into the Ukrainian constitution there would need to be a referendum. So this is very complicated stuff, and it could come down to a showdown again in the Oval Office tomorrow on Monday, when Zelensky, possibly with Starmer in tow, will face up to Trump. And if that goes well, and I'm not remotely convinced that it will, then Trump says Putin will then potentially meet him again. I mean, these are extraordinary times, extraordinary scenes. You mentioned the summit in Alaska on Friday, and we had the sort of the press there, and very briefly included. But as soon as journalists started asking Putin whether he was going to stop killing civilians, questions he will not have been asked in Moscow, of course, the press were ushered out, very different to the sort of Oval Office scenes that we've seen lately. That's right, and something that we're not used to Trump doing. Not answering questions. He usually loves to be able to talk. And Janelle, I'll move on to the Sunday Times, but there is a similar story on the front there. The suggestion that President Putin will be looking to take over the Donbass, which includes Donetsk, as you mentioned, and Luhansk, in return for peace. What do you think could happen in the White House tomorrow? As Matthew says, the suggestion that some European leaders might be invited as well, but it was such an appalling scene last time we saw him there. Do you expect the same kind of thing?
Well, I think it's very interesting that as soon as Trump came out, the first thing he's saying is, well, Zelensky needs to get this done, and the European leaders need to come and help, i.e. I have not managed to get it done. And I do think that after all the air miles that will have been travelled and will be travelled to go to America tomorrow, I can't see that the deal is going to be done, because essentially the whole reason why this began is Putin saying, I want this region, I want some of Ukraine, and Ukraine saying, we don't want to give anything up, not even an inch, which is why the fighting has gone on so long after the original invasion. So what will have changed in anybody's mind substantively on that divisive point to stop the fighting? Because where will the ceasefire come from? Because Zelensky still doesn't want to give up anything, and Putin still wants what he wants. So we haven't moved on in terms of the mentality and the thinking. And the problem, since sanctions that the West imposed in the early weeks of this war or of this invasion, the problem has been, how are we going to get a resolution when Russia seemed to be able to weather those sanctions? And Trump has been threatening secondary sanctions, hasn't he, on India, for example. Countries that buy Russian oil. And I suppose the question has always been, therefore, when you're dealing with a nuclear power that has a bigger nuclear arsenal than America, can any American president actually bring the sort of pressure to bear on Putin that will make him stop this war without concessions? Just adding chaos. I think what we're seeing actually add to the mix is just a lot of chaos, standoffs, meeting in the Oval Office. And what happens is the theatre actually takes over what should be a peace talk of sensible, thoughtful negotiations, actually asking people, what are you willing to give? And these conversations actually turn into just brinkmanship, and Putin walks away and says, well, we had a nice chat. And the whole thought that me and you are having an argument and we want to make peace, so you and you go into a conversation is the stuff of, well, how is peace made when you're not even in the room, including European leaders? And the chaos is dressed up, isn't it? As, oh, well, Trump, he's a businessman, he could do these deals. Not a deal. Whatever he says is sort of part of the art of the deal, which lets him off the hook. And Trump also has said that he thinks now the move should be to go straight to a peace deal, opposite of what President Zelensky wants. So again, that sets the stage. It makes it tough
starting point for President Zelensky tomorrow. I'm just going to take us on to the Sunday Express because they also continue the story.
Yeah.
The world's in grave danger if West caves in to Putin. And the risk is here, as according to the Europeans, is that if you set this pressure, Putin's from his invasion,
Yes.
he may be tempted to do it again.
And this has been part of sort of Western thinking all along, that if we give in to Putin, if we allow him to walk all over Ukraine, if we allow him to win this war, then he will be empowered and emboldened. Quite what that empowerment might look like, I've never been quite sure. I mean, is it going to make it more likely that he invades Britain? Almost certainly not. Is it going to make it more likely that he might invade one of the Baltic states, which are part of NATO, and therefore an invasion would trigger Article 5? Possibly. And I think that is a real concern. And what we've seen at that summit in Alaska is the red carpet rolled out for someone who is wanted for war crimes. And that in itself is extraordinary imagery. But I've sort of fire, really, in my public comments and on social media and so forth, because although I think it is disgusting, as Boris Johnson says in the Mail on Sunday, at the same time you could argue it's necessary because people are dying in horrific numbers. All of us want the suffering to stop. But the question is, what are you prepared to do in order to stop the suffering, and can anything be done?
But whilst they were having the meeting, the suffering was still continuing,
Yes.
and people were still dying whilst they were in Alaska
Yes.
with the red carpet rolled out, which is an extraordinary thing to think we're going to have a peace talk, and even in that time there is no let-up of what they're doing to make their own end.
Does Putin have to talk to Trump? And obviously Trump will talk to Zelensky tomorrow, but does that have to happen if the war is going to end at all? Diplomacy has to
Well,
take
he's
its course.
inserted himself to such a point now,
Yes.
it's hard to see how you get to any peace deal without Trump being somehow involved. Does he have to be involved? Well, technically, no. Like the European, but the European
Does he have
leaders
to
are
call him the
completely,
boss?
they're completely frozen
Okay.
out, and I think it's just really hard to see how we're going to get an end to this with the chaos.
More of this later, and all the other stories in the papers, but for the moment, thanks very much indeed.
Hear that whistle and